Yeah, we're going to get our next panel started here. I'm very pleased to be joined by Tim Hite. Tim Hite is down there at the end. He is the Director of Policy at Exodus. We have John Arnold in the middle here, Principal at 1031, and Rob Hamilton, CEO at AnchorWatch. Thank you for joining me, gentlemen. We are talking about policy challenges for Bitcoin startups today. This is a great topic, and we've got some of the best here to dig into it with me here. So, gonna kick it straight to Rob here. We're gonna go right off the deep end. Rob, you are sort of your business is very sort of centered on insurance, right? And there are some interesting rules when it comes to insurance, particularly when we're talking about Bitcoin. And I think the most specific sort of policy issue is the classification of admitted assets. And as it stands right now, as far as I understand, Bitcoin is not an admitted asset. So can you dig into that and tell us what exactly the problem is there for you?
Well, I would dig in really deep, but we only have 15 minutes. So I'll keep it at a very high level in that the health of an insurance company is its balance sheet, right? The extension of its surplus, which allows it to write larger and larger pools of capital and kind of have more risk distribution. Today, as it stands, Bitcoin, if you are a large admitted carrier and you were to buy Bitcoin, you actually have to write off all of the value you put into Bitcoin to zero. Structurally, it's just because it's treated as like a new asset, high risk, when as the reality is it's highly liquid and secure and very good for collateral, right? So at the highest level, the entire insurance industry in the United States, this is governed actually at the state level. There's the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, where each state has their own insurance commissioner, which appoints to the self-regulatory body, and they've very clearly stated up to this point that Bitcoin's not admitted. So that's just, if anyone's familiar with the FASB rules and how the accounting standards changed for publicly traded companies, this is like that, but way more extreme and you can understand insurance being a risk-adverse industry. They want to be careful, but I think we've well past the point of Bitcoin being established as a collateral asset. You can mark to market it every day, or even by the minute, right? It trades 24/7, 365. In that sense, it's much more liquid and better capital than a lot of other alternatives that insurance companies are using today.
Yeah, and going to kick it over to you, John. You all have actually invested in AnchorWatch, as far as I understand. 1031 is one of the leading Bitcoin venture funds. So I want to kick it over to you. I know we talked before this, and you mentioned that money transmitter laws, money services businesses has obviously been a challenge for you. Yeah, just kind of curious, you've worked with a lot of startups. That's kind of what you do on a daily basis. So what's the biggest thing that you're seeing?
Yeah, I would say very proud to have led AnchorWatch's last round, and we've invested in over 30 companies at this point. And the money services business issue, the MTL issue, is, I think, an existential one for all of them. At the risk of beating a dead horse from the content that we've heard today on virtually every panel, I think Matt Corallo earlier today, called it just that, an existential issue. If we want to have a Bitcoin industry of any type, essentially, in the United States, sorting out the money transmitter question, what constitutes a money transmitter, and specifically, ideally, getting to a point where there's a very explicit legislation indicating and codifying that non-custodial service providers, infrastructure providers, open source software providers that do not ever control or take custody of user funds do not constitute money services businesses and do not constitute money transmitters. Getting to that point is, I think, just something that is far and away the primary policy priority that any Bitcoin business has to have right now. There's a nuance. There are a lot of nuances in Bitcoin that are, I think, increasingly, because of what BPI has done, maybe less lost on policymakers. But a few years ago, it was very difficult to kind of get across to a lot of policymakers and legislators who hadn't really looked at the space closely that, in principle, the idea of trying to apply a money services business definition to a Bitcoin miner or to a Lightning node or a Lightning service provider, in principle, could not be done, right? Even if those businesses want to comply, because of the way that those processes work, there is simply no practical way for them to even comply with the type of KYC AML regulations that would be incumbent upon them if they were to be deemed as full money services businesses. Up until recently, most businesses in the space that we worked with operated kind of based on existing FinCEN guidance from 2019, suggesting that non-custodial service providers were not money transmitters. That's been called into question by a variety of cases over the last year. And I think at the very least, while we have a more, it seems, friendly administration in place right now relative to what the industry was looking at over the prior 4 years, that mood and that the backdrop could change very quickly, even by the midterms, right? Like, we don't know what's going to happen a year from now. So getting to a point where legislation firmly and fully codifies those definitions rather than leaving it up to a precedent that might be set by one district court judge or by one attorney writing a certain brief and enshrining an opinion into law effectively is I think a position that we all want to get into. And I think getting to that point where we have that firmly codified in legislation is, again, just an existential issue for any business that wants to build Bitcoin services in the United States.
Yeah, and I think to dig into this a little bit further, right, we recently heard that there's a possibility of the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act being incorporated into the Clarity Act, which is our market structure bill. So, Tim, I want to go to you on this. One thing that we talked about in the green room as well was sort of the need for regulatory clarity. And so I'm curious, what it means to basically lump the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act into a larger bill that is also, sort of intended to provide that kind of clarity.
Well, we were fortunate to see a version of the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act incorporated into Clarity. It was under Section 110. And for the most part, it's not really something that is that partisan, because if you look at the last 4 years under the Biden administration, and we can talk about a lot of the enforcement cases and a lot of the challenges that companies faced, FinCEN never rescinded that guidance. That guidance always withstood now both administrations. So it's good to see that bipartisan momentum carried it into the Clarity Act. On the note, though, of challenges that startups face as well, beyond just what the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, hopefully we'll also see some of the more, I guess, Operation Choke Point issues be addressed under this administration as well. And that kind of gets lost a little bit in the crypto conversation. We hear a lot about stablecoins. We hear a lot about market structure. And rightfully so, not to downplay the importance that those will have on the market and the development in the U.S., but you got to look at the past 4 years with what we saw in the debanking space and what we've seen issued through guidance and policy statements at the banking regulators. It's been great so far, but it's only as good as whatever administration's in control. So to protect against anything like that happening again, I believe there also needs to be focus on ensuring that startups can go get the financial services from the traditional financial institutions. And I know that sounds like it goes against the ethos of Bitcoin and financial autonomy and individual empowerment, but a lot of these businesses do rely on those traditional financial services, just like having a bank account, for instance. So for startups that are looking in the future, for startups that want to be here, I think it's important to know that they have a financial system that they can access. And hopefully that conversation doesn't get lost as the policy conversations continue.
Yeah, I want to go back to you, Tim. I want to shift gears a little bit here and talk about how Bitcoin startups or even more established Bitcoin businesses can interact with policymakers, right, and to sort of enact the change that we've been discussing here on this panel. So you're obviously sort of around it on a daily basis, Rob and John, maybe to a lesser degree. What is involved with actually putting these changes into practice?
So I started with Exodus in January. Prior to that, I worked on Capitol Hill. I was on the Financial Service Committee, so I saw how those interactions took place on a daily basis. It really is, I know we've heard about it all day, but it really is an educational effort. Anyone can go contact their congressman, contact the relevant committees, and usually staff are pretty responsive. If you have a business, they want to hear how it works. I forget who said it earlier. If you see legislation that's written wrong, a lot of times it's not purposefully done that way. It is that policymakers just perhaps didn't know, or staff did not know the implications of how they wrote a certain bill. So, I would reemphasize the importance of contacting, your congressman and going to DC. And I know it's harder for smaller startups, but you don't need an in-house lobbyist, right? Everyone has a congressman if you're based in the U.S. And for the most part, I think they do want to hear and they do want to learn from those startups.
Yeah, John, I want to go to you here. I am curious with the startups that you do work with, how many are tracking these policy issues very closely? I think probably that's a sort of crucial element of their business, right? It could put them out of business. I'm curious, to the extent that paying attention to these policy issues might actually be sort of detracting from their larger mission.
Yeah, I'd say two things. The first is, everyone in the industry, I think, is highly aware of everything that we're talking about here. Early last year, I was really proud that the 1031 portfolio kind of came together. The vast majority of our companies signed onto an open letter that we submitted to FinCEN about some of these issues and some of these things that we felt needed clarification. So it's something that every founder in the space that we've talked to is aware of, and I think Rob can certainly speak to that. And I would echo, it's something that affects them even outside of the question of what constitutes a money services business. The debanking point is something that has affected a lot of our founders, a lot of our companies on a day-to-day basis. It's an odd state of affairs when we've had many companies tell us that they've had banking relationships where they got to the 1 yard line, and we're not able to get across, despite the fact that bank has gambling and kind of ATF accounts and all sorts of accounts with businesses that you would otherwise think are much more maybe questionable or controversial or unsavory than a Bitcoin custody business, for example, or a business that allows you to buy Bitcoin. And yet, a lot of these founders, a lot of these companies have been kind of turned away from very basic access to banking rails, whether it's just for their own kind of balance sheets or for FBO accounts for customers, just because of some of the fears around so-called reputational risk that FDIC, OCC, and the Fed, the three main banking regulators, were up until last week, including in their kind of banking examination practices. And so it's something that, to answer your question directly, it's whether there are broad legal questions that need to be answered on the MTL question, and there are just kind of day-to-day issues and headaches caused by some of this lack of clarity around what banks can and cannot do, what they can and cannot service. So it's top of mind for all founders for sure.
Rob, we're coming up on time here. I think we've spoken with other startups and spoken with you obviously at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, and I get the sense that there's some hope, that things are sort of heading in the right direction. I want you to kind of take that apart for me. What exactly is giving you hope, and what does that mean for your business?
Well, I think the hope that we see from this is that I think increasing the dialogue and seeing kind of the traction and progress, seeing bills in the House and the Senate, and kind of seeing kind of what we've been looking for is just clarity and understanding market structure, right? All of these things, money server business, for us at AnchorWatch, we are never able to unilaterally move funds, but are we a custodian? Are we not a custodian? Qualified custody, right? All of these things, we want to follow the path and do the right thing. And we're doing a lot of research, finding out that it's, it's vague, right? And it's nothing even malicious. It's just that software always moves faster than legislation just by the process of governance and things moving slowly and kind of being a deliberative process versus writing code. And I think the positive traction is that there's been some sort of a catch-up on the legislative side and a lot of the work that the Bitcoin Policy Institute does in kind of enabling that education and understanding, even thinking specifically, not even at the federal level, but also the state level, the state level framework for being able to have just good neutral language for just, these are good guardrails in ways that if you want to, for state strategic reserve, you want to be able to follow the rules. And I think all of this, across local, state, federal, we're starting to just see a better dialogue, a two-way dialogue, right? It's not us making demands, it's us trying to understand that middle ground so that we can all kind of build businesses that add value to, everyone.
Wonderful. We are finishing up actually a little bit early here, so we'll give you all back some time. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. And yeah, have a great afternoon.
Thank you.